The slap never landed. That was the part nobody talked about afterward. Not the diamonds, not the poison, not the way Augustin Voss stood perfectly still in the middle of that ballroom and watched it all happen with an expression that gave absolutely nothing away. What people remembered, if they remembered anything at all, was the girl in the catering uniform, who threw herself between a 72-year-old woman and a manicured hand moving at full force. That girl was Trudie Balch. She weighed 260 pounds, wore a size 18 apron that kept riding up on her left side, and had been working the Voss estate gala for exactly 4 hours when her life changed completely. She hadn't wanted the shift. That part matters, because later people would ask her why she did it, why she stepped in, why she didn't look away like everyone else in that room did. And the honest answer was that she almost didn't go at all. She'd been scheduled to cover a bridal shower in Westmount, but Celine had called in sick, and the agency was desperate, and Trudie needed the money for her mother's physio appointments, and she couldn't really say no, so she said yes and took the metro to NDG and stood outside the wrought iron gates of the Voss property in the February cold, thinking the guests wore more money than she made in a year. She was 26. She'd been doing catering and hotel work since she was 19, first in Sault Ste. Marie, where she was from, then in Montreal after her sister moved there, and Trudie followed because she always followed her sister. She was good at the work, quiet, efficient, didn't spill, remembered faces. Her supervisor Normand called her his best floor girl. He also called her sweetheart and hon and other things she'd learned to let slide, because the tips were better when she smiled. The Voss Gala was something else entirely. She'd worked large events before, corporate dinners, fundraisers for hospitals, the occasional wedding where the budget was obscene and the flowers alone cost more than her rent. But the Voss estate was in a different category. 3 floors of a house that looked more like a chateau than anything residential, staff in coordinated uniforms, a string quartet in the East Wing, and more security personnel than she could quietly count. The guests arrived in cars that didn't have model names she recognized. The women wore dresses that moved like water. Trudie carried a tray of champagne flutes and kept her eyes level and her expression pleasant, and reminded herself that she had a physio appointment to pay for. She noticed the old woman at around 9:30. She was sitting alone near the French doors that led out to the winter terrace, tucked slightly behind a column, as if she'd placed herself there, deliberately, or wandered there without meaning to. She was small and thin, with white hair pinned back and a black dress that was clearly expensive and clearly important, the kind of dress you wore to signal something. But she was holding her evening bag the wrong way, clutching it by the clasp end, the open end pointing toward the floor. And she was looking at the door with an expression that Trudie had seen before. Her grandmother had worn that expression in the last 2 years of her life. That particular lost but trying not to show, it look that meant the room had stopped making sense. Trudie set her tray down on a side table and walked over. "Can I get you anything?" she said. "Water, maybe, or I can find you somewhere a little quieter to sit." The woman looked up at her. Her eyes were dark and sharp, and there was still a great deal of intelligence in them, the kind that didn't go away easily, just got clouded sometimes. "I was looking for the garden," she said. "There's still a garden," Trudie said. "But it's February, so it's mostly snow right now. Not very interesting." The woman considered this seriously. "That's true," she said. "Snow isn't very interesting. My name's Trudie. What's yours?" "Elvira," she said. Then, more quietly, as if checking, "Elvira Voss." Trudie didn't react to the name, even though she recognized it. Elvira Voss was the reason half the people in this room were here. She was the matriarch of the family, the woman who had built the foundation that bore the Voss name, the woman whose son, the one standing across the room with the dark suit and the still expression, controlled more of Montreal's underground economy than anyone in this city liked to admit publicly. "Elvira," Trudie said. "That's a beautiful name. It was my aunt's name." That wasn't true. But Elvira smiled, and her shoulders came down slightly, and Trudie sat beside her and stayed. For 20 minutes, She stayed. She should have been circulating. Normand would have noticed by now, would be scanning the room for her, would clock her tray sitting abandoned on the side table. She knew all of this, and she stayed anyway, because Elvira Voss was describing a garden that existed in some version of her memory, and Trudie didn't think it was right to leave her alone in the middle of a ballroom full of people who weren't looking at her. She found out later that Elvira's usual attendant had been pulled away by a family member for some private meeting. She found out later what that meeting was about. At the time, she only knew that this woman was alone and shouldn't be, and that the kind thing to do, the only reasonable thing, was to sit with her until someone who belonged here came looking. She didn't account for Renata. Renata Deschaines arrived the way she always arrived, which was loudly and in a dress that cost significantly more than it covered. She was 34, the kind of beautiful that required full-time maintenance, and she had been Augustin Voss's fiancée for 8 months. Trudie had not known any of this going into the evening. She learned it in about 45 seconds. Renata came through the crowd with the specific momentum of someone used to things moving out of her way, and when she saw Elvira, her soon-to-be mother-in-law, sitting in the corner talking to a catering girl, her expression shifted through several things before settling on something cold and controlled. "Elvira," she said. Not warmly. "What are you doing over here?" Elvira looked up. There was a flicker of something, recognition, and also wariness. "I was talking to Trudie," she said. "She knows about gardens." Renata looked at Trudie for the first time. The look lasted approximately 2 seconds and managed to communicate quite a lot in that time. "You should be working," she said. "I was just keeping Mrs. Voss company while—" I didn't ask for an explanation. Renata's voice was pleasant in the way that very cold things can seem pleasant before you touch them. "You should be working. Go." Trudie stood. She wasn't going to argue. She'd learned a long time ago that arguing with the guests wasn't worth the energy, and she needed this shift to go smoothly, and she had a tray to find and champagne to circulate. She picked up her tray. She was 3 steps away when she heard Elvira say something soft and confused about the garden again, and she heard Renata's response, too quiet for the room but not quiet enough. "Stop it! You're embarrassing him." "Stop." Trudie kept walking. She made it to the far end of the room. She picked up 2 flutes of champagne for a couple near the fireplace and smiled and moved on. She told herself it wasn't her business. She told herself lots of things. She was halfway back across the room when she saw Renata reach out and grab Elvira's wrist. Not gently. Elvira made a small sound and pulled back, and Renata said something close to her ear, and whatever it was made the old woman flinch. Actually flinch, her whole small body going tight. And Trudie's tray was already set down before she'd consciously made a decision about it. She moved quickly for a woman her size. People said that sometimes, in the way people sometimes said things like that, as if they expected her to be slow. She was not slow. She crossed the floor in about 6 seconds and put herself between Renata and Elvira with enough presence that Renata actually took a step back. "Don't touch her like that," Trudie said. The room, in their immediate vicinity, went quiet. Renata stared at her. For a moment she seemed genuinely unsure of what she was looking at. "Excuse me," she said. "You grabbed her wrist hard enough to hurt her. Don't do that. You do not speak to me." "She's confused," Trudie said, and her voice came out steady, which surprised her somewhat. "She's not embarrassing anyone. She's an elderly woman who got turned around in a large room. That's not something to grab someone over." Renata's face went through several stages. Disbelief. Calculation. "Do you know who I am?" she said. "I know you're hurting a 72-year-old woman's wrist," Trudie said. "Let go!" There was a silence that Trudie would think about for a long time afterward. She thought about it on the metro home. She thought about it while she was trying to sleep. The way that silence stretched, and everyone in the immediate radius was watching and not watching at the same time. That particular thing crowds do where they witness without wanting to be witnessed, witnessing. Renata let go of Elvira's wrist. And then she smiled, which was somehow worse. "You're finished," she said very quietly to Trudie. "You understand that? I'll have you removed, I'll have you blacklisted. I'll make sure your agency never gets another event booking in this city. You're done." Trudie said nothing. There wasn't really anything to say. Elvira reached over and patted Trudie's hand, very gently, as if comforting her. "She knows about gardens," she told Renata, with great dignity. Normand pulled Trudie aside 10 minutes later. He looked genuinely sorry about it, which she appreciated and which didn't change anything. Renata Deschênes had spoken to the event coordinator, who had spoken to the estate manager, and Trudie was being asked to collect her things and leave the premises. She would be paid for the full shift, which was technically generous and also felt like being handed a coat as you were shown the door. She got her bag from the staff room. She put on her coat. She was calculating what she would tell the agency and whether there was any version of this story that didn't end with her getting fewer bookings, when someone said her name. She turned around. The man, standing in the hallway, was tall, dark-suited, and had the kind of face that didn't give information away for free. He was older than her, late 30s, she thought, maybe early 40s, and he had grey beginning at his temples and dark eyes that were currently looking at her with an expression she couldn't read at all. She knew who he was. She had not expected him to know her name. "Augustin Voss," he said, which was not a question. "Trudie Balch," she said, which was. A pause. He looked at her the way people looked at things they were still forming opinions about. "You stayed with my mother for 20 minutes before Renata arrived," he said. "I know because I watched." She hadn't known that. She hadn't seen him watching. She thought about that for a moment and decided not to be unsettled by it. "She was alone," Trudie said. "That didn't seem right. She has an attendant. Her attendant wasn't there." Another pause. He said, "What did she talk about?" "A garden," she said. "There used to be a garden." I told her the garden was still there, but it was February and mostly snow. Something shifted in his face, something small. If she hadn't been watching carefully, she would have missed it entirely. "There is a garden," he said. "She planted it herself when she was 40. There are roses in it. Not in February." "I told her that," Trudie said. "She said snow wasn't very interesting." I agreed with her. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Renata has you removed." "Yes. She threatened your agency. That part I'll deal with. You're not angry." "I'm a little angry," Trudie said honestly. "But I don't think it would help anything to be angry here." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You said she grabbed my mother's wrist. Hard enough to hurt her." "My mother didn't tell me that." "She might not remember it," Trudie said, "or she might not have wanted to cause trouble." She paused. People with dementia learn very quickly which things they're allowed to say and which things make the people around them tense. She's not unaware. She's just moving through a different version of the room than everyone else. Augustin Voss was looking at her with an expression that she would later describe privately as recalibration. "How do you know about dementia?" he said. "My grandmother," Trudie said. 5 years. I was there for a lot of it, a silence that was different from the one in the ballroom. This one had more weight to it. "Go home," he said finally. "I'll speak to your agency in the morning. They won't lose the booking." She should have said thank you and left. That would have been the sensible thing. "What are you going to do about Renata?" she said. He looked at her. "That's not a question you're meant to ask me," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm asking anyway." A very long pause. "Go home, Miss Balch," he said. She went home. The agency called at 8 the next morning. Not to tell her she'd been let go, to tell her she'd been requested, specifically requested, by name, for a private household position. Full-time. Live out. The address was in Outremont. The salary figure Normand quoted her, voice slightly strained, was nearly double what she made in a month of catering shifts. "You don't have to take it," Normand said. "But I think you should know the person who called was very clear that they wanted you specifically." She took the number and sat on the edge of her bed for a while, thinking about it. Her apartment was small and the radiator was unreliable, and she had $300 left until the end of the month, after paying for her mother's last physiotherapy session. She had been doing this work for 7 years. She was good at it. She had a certificate in hospitality services, and she had worked very hard, and she was 26 years old, and she had never once, not one single time, been requested by name. She called back. The house in Outremont was smaller than the estate, which was to say, it was still enormous by any reasonable standard, but human scale enormous, rather than institution scale. A woman named Florette met her at the door, older, brisk, and with the air of someone who had been running households since before Trudie was born. She walked Trudie through the position without a great deal of warmth, but also without unkindness. The role was private household assistant. The primary responsibility was Elvira Voss, who required consistent, patient care, and who responded badly to transitions and to strangers. The secondary responsibilities were coordination with the household staff, light administrative tasks, and whatever else came up. The hours were defined, but occasionally not. The position included full benefits and 3 weeks leave per year. "Who made the hiring decision?" Trudie asked. Florette gave her a look that said the question was technically out of scope. Then, she said, "Mr. Voss reviewed candidates. There were other candidates. You were the only candidate, Miss Balch." Trudie absorbed this. "And Renata Deschaines?" she said. "She threatened to have me blacklisted. Ms. Deschaines is no longer associated with this household as of last night," Florette said with the careful neutrality of someone who has said exactly what they have been told to say. Trudie looked at her for a moment. "What happened?" she said. Florette said, "That's not a question I'm in a position to answer." Trudie started the following Monday. She found out eventually, in pieces. Not from Florette, who was never going to tell her anything she hadn't been specifically authorized to share. Not from Augustin himself, who she saw rarely, and who, when she did see him, spoke to her with a directness that wasn't quite warmth, but was something in its vicinity. She found out from Elvira. It came in fragments over several weeks, the way information always came from Elvira. Not in sequence, not always in the right tense, but always true. A mention of Renata and the word poison, which Trudie initially filed away as possible confusion. A description of something happening with a glass and a doctor coming and a test. A memory of Augustin's face when he was told something and how it looked, she said, like the door closing. Trudie eventually understood, in broad terms, what had been found. What she understood was that Renata Deschaines, who had been set to inherit a great deal through marriage, had been taking a slow and careful approach to that inheritance. That Elvira's sudden episodes of disorientation had increased significantly in the past 8 months. That when the household physician ran tests, after a conversation that Trudie was told had been initiated by Augustin the morning after the gala, they found something that shouldn't have been in Elvira's system. What she understood was that Renata was gone, and there were people who handled what came next, and those people were not Trudie, and the details were not for her. What she understood was that the reason she had been hired was not charity. It was that Augustin Voss had watched a stranger, a catering girl, as his people called her, not unkindly, sit with his mother for 20 minutes at a party full of people who had known Elvira for decades and looked past her, and something in him had made a decision before he had consciously made a decision. She had been in the position for about 6 weeks when she first saw him on a Sunday. He came to the house on Sundays for dinner with Elvira. Trudie was there because Elvira had been having a difficult week, and Florette had asked if she would consider coming in on the weekend, and she had said yes, and she was in the kitchen helping with the prep when she heard him arrive. She stayed in the kitchen. It wasn't her place to be in the dining room for a family dinner. She knew where her place was. He came to find her at 7:15. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and her phone, reading the news, and he appeared in the doorway in a way that suggested he hadn't entirely planned to be there. "She's asking for you," he said. "I'll come, she told me you've been reading her poetry," he said. Trudie looked up. "She asked me to. She has a collection by Gilles Vigneault. She likes it when someone reads it aloud." He was quiet for a moment. "My father used to read her Vigneault," he said. "I know. She told me." He looked at her across the kitchen. There was something in that look that Trudie didn't examine too closely. Not yet, because she was sensible and she understood what this was, and she understood what it wasn't, and she had work to do. She's in good hands, she said. I want you to know that. I know, he said. And then, quietly, I didn't expect this. She didn't ask what he meant. She thought she understood. She got up and brought her tea with her and went to read to Elvira, and she was aware, walking past him in the doorway, of how small the space was between them and of the fact that he didn't move back. She didn't let herself think about it for a long time. She was practical. She had always been practical, born that way, and then shaped further by a childhood without much financial cushion and a family that needed things from her and a body that the world had opinions about and a personality that she had learned to use in place of the softer things people expected. She wasn't naive. She was 26 years old and she had not lived as a foolish person. She understood the difference between a man who was kinder to an employee because she had done something that mattered to him and a man who had actual feelings. She did not confuse the two. And yet, Sundays became a thing she was aware of in advance. She didn't let herself be aware of that awareness, but she was aware of it. The way the kitchen felt different when he was in the house. The way he sometimes lingered near doors. The way he asked her, once, about Sault Ste. Marie, not in passing, but with the particular attention of someone who wants to know the answer. Elvira noticed. Of course she did. Elvira, whose memory moved in circles and whose understanding of time was its own complicated thing, was nonetheless entirely clear on the subject of her son. He watches you when you don't look, she told Trudie one afternoon, with the confidence of a woman stating a well-established fact. Elvira, Trudie said. I'm not wrong, Elvira said. You're sometimes not wrong, Trudie said carefully. Elvira patted her knee. He's lonely, she said. He's been lonely a long time. He doesn't show it the way other people do. Trudie said nothing. She thought about the kitchen doorway. She thought about the Vigneault collection. You're good, Elvira said. You're a good person. That's not as common as people think. Trudie looked at her. So are you, she said. Elvira smiled. She said, but I'm old and I can say so. You should practice. It was February again, nearly a year from the night of the gala, when Augustin came to the house on a Wednesday, which he never did, and found Trudie in the garden. The roses were not blooming. They wouldn't bloom until May. But it was a warmer week, and Elvira had wanted to see the garden even in its winter form. And Trudie had bundled her up and brought her outside, and they had walked the gravel paths very slowly, and looked at the bare canes, and Elvira had touched one of them with the tips of her gloved fingers, and said, "They'll come back. They always come back." They had gone back inside 20 minutes ago. Trudie had settled Elvira for her afternoon rest, and come back out because it was quiet and she had her own coat, and she wanted 5 minutes of cold air. She heard the door and turned around. Augustin stopped on the terrace steps. He looked at her in the garden, in her coat, with the bare something happened in his face. Florette said you were here, he said. I needed some air. He came down the steps. He was not dressed for the cold, work clothes, open coat, and he didn't seem to care. He stopped a few feet from her and looked at the garden. She came outside, he said, not a question. She wanted to see it. She said they'd come back. He nodded slowly. She says that every February it's a good thing, say. He looked at her then, the way he had looked at her in the hallway a year ago, that same quality of trying to figure something out that he hadn't expected to need to figure out. I want to tell you something, he said. She waited. This is not a simple life, he said. What I do, what this family is. You understand that you already know enough to understand it. Yes, she said. I'm telling you that because I want you to make a clear-eyed decision, not because I don't want. He stopped. Started again. I'm not a man who says things the way they should be said. I don't do that well. I've noticed, she said. He looked at her and there was something almost like surprise, and then something she hadn't seen on his face before, which was the beginning of a smile. I've been watching you, he said. Elvira told me. Of course she did. He was quiet for a moment. You came out here to look at the roses. They're not here yet. They'll come back, he said. She looked at him. She thought about her grandmother, and Elvira's garden, and the ballroom a year ago, and the metro home in the cold, and Normand calling at 8 in the morning, and the kitchen doorway on Sunday evenings, and all of it. The whole strange, improbable series of things that had led from a catering shift she hadn't wanted to take to this February garden, with this impossible man standing 4 feet away from her, saying improbable things. She thought about what Elvira had said about good people not being as common as everyone thought. She took 1 step toward him. That was enough. He closed the rest of the distance himself, and the bare rose canes were around them, and the snow was mostly there but beginning to let go, and somewhere above them in the house, Elvira Voss was sleeping in the knowledge that the garden always came back. It always came back.